in the concept of take back your country. And what I'm referring to is an article I've written in Spectator. It's called Tyranny is Always Capricious, meaning there's a double standard about tyranny. And the National Cabinet is a dismal failure. Now, if you want to read this, you just Google spectator.com.au and put my name on it and you'll find the article. And what I try to say before there is that never before have we in Australia, even in wartime, been governed by a grand coalition of the political parties, underwritten by big business, with the mainstream media completely tranquilized. And this is the National Cabinet, and that's how it's operating. And one thing is very clear from this experience, that Australia desperately needs a blueprint of how to deal with similar pandemics. Because in many ways, I think the conclusion will be the cure here has been far worse than the disease. There should be a royal commission into this. And interestingly, we have a person who could head a royal commission on this, and he has been internationally acclaimed for his work in pandemic planning and communication, all forgotten. This was when he was the Minister for Health, and I'm talking about the 28th Prime Minister, Tony Abbott. He would be the ideal person to run such a royal commission so that we have a blueprint as to how we can deal with such matters in the future. Pandemics come and go. Some of the medical experts think that they're going to be more common than they have been in the past. The problem is we can't have a lockdown just because of a pandemic unless it's going to achieve something. And we rushed into this pandemic. It's very clear that it was overdone. And I think that the conclusions will be you should not rush into a pandemic, especially on the basis of modeling about what might happen in the future from an organization in London and in Washington State, both of which have been shown to produce vastly exaggerated modeling in the past, as they did on this occasion. Governments should not be panicked into doing what they did on this occasion. And remember, this wasn't a lockdown of the public sector. This was a lockdown which particularly impacted on small business and the people who have jobs in small businesses. And it has in many ways done enormous damage in that part of the economy, probably for little purpose. And what will be shown, I would think, in a proper investigation into modeling and into how to handle a pandemic, is that what you really do is do what is world's best practice. A lot is made of the fact that we, compared with Europe and the United States, didn't have a large number of deaths. And that is so. But it wasn't because of what government did. It's because we are a remote island nation. We shouldn't be comparing ourselves with Britain or the United States. We should be comparing ourselves with Taiwan, which is not remote, very close to China, but because it applied what it had developed as world's best practice, it had 1/15 of the deaths in Australia that has about the same population. We, being remote, should have had something closer to Fiji's, another remote island, which had 0 deaths. And ours has been, in many ways, mismanaged. So many things were rushed into, for example, the closing of all elective surgery, because it was believed that the hospitals would be full, and they certainly weren't. What we have to do in the future is make sure that we don't repeat the mistakes of this occasion. What happened in this occasion was that the Prime Minister brought together all of the states, and that was all very well, but they did it in the National Cabinet. So it became necessary to produce a consensus. The consensus is all right, provided it's right, and on this occasion, it was very wrong. They delayed too long strict controls on entry. They stopped a lot of entry from China, but the other entry was not strict. People weren't tested when they came in, as they are in other countries, and people weren't put into quarantine, and the Taiwanese worked out a very efficient way of home quarantine, provided that you used your mobile phones as they required to ensure that you were actually at home. So we have a lot to learn, and we shouldn't allow the politicians to claim credit for something they should not be claiming credit. We should have had a much lower death rate, and we certainly shouldn't have had the terrible damage that has been done to so many businesses and so many people, and to the lives of so many people who've stopped going to the doctor, to the elective surgery which has been suspended and which may well lead to very serious problems for those people. We are in a mess, and we must never do this again. That's the most important thing to learn from this. What the Prime Minister did was clever. Realizing he'd had a very bad press during the bushfires, he decided that he would bring the press in. He duchessed the press, that old term which was used to refer to what happened to Australian politicians in colonial times when they went to London. They were very well treated, and they became very pro-imperial. What he did was to invite top journalists in from all of the mainstream press into the cabinet room for private briefings. And they were impressed by this. The result was they didn't subject the governments, all of the governments, to proper analysis, proper challenge, which is the role of a free press. And there were leading members of big business who were all behind, all for a lockdown. So we had the situation of Labour and Liberal supporting a lockdown, a rather savage lockdown. We had big business, the usual suspects in big business supporting it, and we had a tranquilized mainstream media. And the result was that the cure has been worse than the disease, and that mustn't be repeated. That's the gist of my piece, which is in Spectator Australia, which you can catch if you go into the web, if you Google Spectator Australia, or go to spectator.com.au and check my name, and you'll find the article there. Peter.
Yeah, nice to talk to you again, Professor. Yeah, look, I totally agree again. I think the biggest debacle was in New South Wales with the Ruby Princess, and things like that could have been nipped in the bud very quick. They got caught with their pants down there big time. And as regard to the National Cabinet, so why did they do away with COAG, David?
Well, COAG was another name for the earlier manifestation of meetings between the premiers and the Prime Minister. We used to call it the Premiers' Conference, the Premiers' Conference. Proper name and appropriate that they meet together from time to time. Bob Hawke, as politicians so often do, saw a great reform in changing the name. He also added the president of the Local Government Association, so he could say it was all levels of government. So we got COAG, and now we have the National Cabinet. These are name changes. They don't mean anything. But what this National Cabinet did, because of the meetings in the middle of the crisis, what it ensured was they had to come to a consensus. And the consensus was wrong. They were panicked by modelling, as many governments around the world were, except the Taiwanese, who'd worked out how to deal with the problem. And there was a fashion of rushing into lockdowns, not to stop the virus, the Wuhan virus. This is not to stop it. This is to flatten the curve. And that just was for the reason that the hospitals would not be flooded with an enormous number of cases. Well, that didn't happen. And now the measures, the lockdown is being treated as if it will completely stop the virus. Well, it won't. The only way that the virus will be stopped is when a vaccination is developed and it's widespread in the community. We're still waiting for a vaccination for AIDS. They've been working on it for years. It still eludes them. It takes a long time sometimes for a vaccination to appear. And then when a vaccination does appear, it isn't always effective. So the virus will be around, other viruses will come. The thing to do is to take measures to do essentially, I think, 3 or 4 things. One is to limit its entry into Australia. And that's easier for us than for countries like Sweden or Britain, which have land borders, and borders of which are difficult to control. So we are in a superior position because of that. The second thing that you have to do is to try and limit the spread of the virus, and you do that, as the Swedes do, by encouraging people to follow good practices, the old-fashioned practices which mothers once taught their children. That is, always carry a handkerchief, sneeze and cough into a handkerchief, not into your sleeve, as they're saying, because that's ridiculous, because you then carry it around openly. And with the handkerchief, you can wash it regularly, whereas jackets aren't cleaned regularly. And the third thing is to look after the most vulnerable. Now, we knew in this case that the most vulnerable are the elderly and those with serious medical conditions. And we should have been better in looking after some of the elderly, particularly in the nursing homes in New South Wales, which seem to fail, but nothing like the massive failure in New York. So that's what you do. And the fourth thing that you should do is, and I think this particularly applies in this case, if there is someone internationally to blame who has misbehaved greatly in relation to the crisis, then you should be looking to finding out whether that was in fact true, and secondly, whether damages should not be paid. And in this case, the communist Chinese have behaved appallingly in letting the virus go around the world, but locking it down in Wuhan, in originally lying about whether it was transmissible, taking over the World Health Organization and getting them to lie too about its transmissibility and whether travel bans should be instituted. And I think the government of communist China is seriously at fault and should be paying something in damages and reparations. Mr. Morrison's idea of an independent investigation was good, but why on earth go to the World Health Organization when you know it's under the control of communist China, that the person at the head of them is a puppet of the communist Chinese and nothing will be obtained out of that? And we don't want just an investigation. We want reparations. That's the important thing. Australia should be paid damages for what has happened because the communist government deliberately kept information about the virus secret. It stopped travel within China, but allowed travel overseas and therefore allowed the spread of the disease without informing the other countries. China has committed a serious offense under international law, and she should have to pay for that. And people will say, well, how will you, if there is an award of damages, how will you get reparations? There are a large number of investments in this country, allegedly by companies from China, but which are entities under the control of the Communist Party of China. They're all state entities, and those properties should, if necessary, be taken as part of the damages if damages are awarded. What should happen is that a commission should be established by a number of powers who are affected, Australia, the United States, and others. That commission of senior judges should look into the case, decide whether there is a case against the communist government, and then award damages. That's how it should be done, and we should be amply repaid for the costs we have incurred. I think some of them have been over-incurred because I do not believe that it was necessary to lock down a lot of small business in this country for little advantage. Peter.
No, you're right, David. And, we talk about an inquiry, but would we get the truth out of that inquiry? Is it just another waste of time and waste of money? I think we deserve compensation, massive compensation. If we have a look at the amount of people now that are out of work, business that have gone to the wall, our suicide rates have gone up. I think it's absolutely disgusting. And I agree entirely with what you said earlier. This is just a knee-jerk reaction. We had that knee-jerk reaction with the live cattle export years ago with Julia Gillard and Nick Xenophon and so on, banning the live cattle export, just about brought this country to its knees. But it's amazing how this virus seems to be very selective. I mean, all of a sudden we've got the football on again, and only so many people can go to the football, but these players are hugging each other, they're spitting on the ground, they're sweating, they're fighting, they're bleeding, but we've got to stand 1.5 metres apart in the street or cafes, 4 square metre radius and all the rest. I mean, I just find this very, very bizarre. Can you imagine in 2017, David, if through the airwaves and on television and everything, we got bombarded with influenza cases, which was 250,000 influenza cases in 2017, and 1,163 people died. How many deaths have we had with this Chinese virus out of Wuhan? About 102 or 107 or something. And I mean, they talk about a pandemic. Sorry,
you're referring, Peter, to the Spanish flu. The
influenza. No. I'm talking about the influenza. Influenza in 2017, 1,163 deaths, 250,000 people affected. You imagine if this was blasted through the airwaves back in 2017, and here we've got this. This is all we hear about this Chinese virus. I think there's a lot more to this. We've got to be a little bit careful with it. Yes, we certainly do. As you mentioned, the older people are vulnerable and so forth. But I just can't see how you can get out on a football field and you can tackle, you can fight. I saw the other night there was blood coming out of a guy's head. They're sweating, they're tapping each other on the backside. I just think it's a whole lot of garbage, to be quite honest. We need to open this country up, and we have to look at the likes of Coles and Woolworths and Audi and all these big places where the big corporates, they stayed open. Thousands and thousands of people going through these stores and everything like that, handling products, putting them back on the shelves, and small businesses absolutely going to the wall. I think it's disgusting. This national cabinet, just this name change, is to me a real worry. I don't think this has been handled properly at all. And in the beginning, Scott Morrison and other premiers were being hailed heroes, but the way they're doing this, dribbling out, you can have 10 people here and then all of a sudden 15 and 20, just open the place up now. Keep your social distancing and all the rest of it. As you've mentioned, with a handkerchief, sneeze into a handkerchief, don't cough all over everybody and so on. But we can't shut this country down for much longer. And you've mentioned before, David, where, the this could happen again. We can't keep shutting this country down every time there's a so-called pandemic. It's just wrong. And yes, there's got to be a blueprint that has to come out of this, and that blueprint's got to happen ASAP. I just think that we've just got to get on with life, because we're in a mess. I mean, they're printing money like there's no tomorrow. You just can't keep doing that. I mean, the likes of, once this stimulus package and all this money that's been handed out stops, boy, fuel prices are starting to go up already. Emergency service levy, NRM levy, taxes will go up. Doesn't matter what it is, they've got to get money back somehow. And unfortunately, you haven't got people in work because they've lost their jobs. A lot of little businesses have gone, so there's less money in GST. So all as they're going to do, these bright politicians are just going to get us with revenue, and we can't afford it. And the next couple of years is going to be absolutely frightening, I think. So I can't understand even now why the premiers and the Prime Minister is still not talking about building things again here in this country like we used to. We used to build everything, and we need to build it again. We really do, David.
Peter, you've raised two very important points, and that is the comparison, the analogy with the decision by Minister Ludwig to cut off the export of live cattle from Australia. He killed the cattle trade for 6 months. And this has recently come before the courts because the judge has found that under the law at the time, it wasn't clear that he had the power to do what he did. And secondly, he went too far. It was an order that he made which wasn't necessary, and it interfered improperly into the common law right that people have to run a business if they want to. And the judge has said that this constitutes misfeasance in public office. He has set the case aside while the parties are to agree on what the damages are. The Commonwealth may appeal, but there's a lot of pressure on the Commonwealth not to appeal. But if damages are calculated, it is estimated that they will be in the range of about $600 million, more than $500 million. It's a lot of money. It won't be the minister who pays, it'll be the taxpayer who pays, but the people involved who suffered will at least be reimbursed. Now, that's very relevant because in this case, there was a similar, I think, misfeasance in that the ministers who executed the decision of the National Cabinet, the National Cabinet takes decisions, and then ministers in the federal government and the states exercise their powers under legislation to take action. And I think they've also gone too far. And they have demonstrated that they weren't serious in many respects about the lockdown, because when people indicated, left-wing anarchists and communists indicated that they would be demonstrating over an event which occurred in Minneapolis, which had nothing to do with Australia, that they would be demonstrating there, the Prime Minister and various premiers indicated their approval and support to this right to protest. And the only reason they stopped further protests or discouraged them was when they saw the way in which the Australian people reacted, because Australians immediately saw that there were double standards, that old ladies were being told they couldn't sit on a park bench. People were being stopped from burying their dead. They weren't allowed to go to funerals. Marriages were being stopped. Businesses were being closed. And yet you had the politicians saying, oh, it's all right to go on a communist-led demonstration about something which happened a long way away and had nothing to do with Australia. That's all right, but you can't run your businesses. You can't do the things which you must do. Burying the dead, marrying young people, and so on. All of this was not to be allowed. It showed that the lockdown in many ways was fictional, and it seemed to be aimed particularly at small business and ordinary people. And the politicians showed themselves to be power drunk as they played around with whether you could have 10 people or 5 people over for dinner. It is all absolutely ridiculous. And as you rightly say, they let the big business off. They let the big shops, the supermarkets off. They were allowed to conduct business, but it was small business which was targeted. Something is terribly wrong about this. And I think that this does deserve, firstly, a blueprint for future matters, but a close look at what's happened, because I expect that, as with the ban on the cattle trade, there will be a flood of claims. There'll be class actions for claiming misfeasance in public office by the public politicians of Australia, but they'll be relaxing in well-paid retirement. They'll probably have all sorts of consultancies, as politicians seem to get when they're in retirement. There'll be jobs for the boys and the girls, but it will be the ordinary people of this country who will be the ones who will be suffering, particularly those working in small business, self-funded retirees and the like. Well, thank you, Peter. I think at this point, unless you would like to say something more, we should bring this to a close.
Yeah, I'd like to just make another comment, if I could, David. Or actually, 2 comments. I would like to know how many carers, how many doctors, how many nurses have been healthcare workers, have come down with this Chinese virus. How many hairdressers who have been working in a very small environment, touching people and all the rest. How many of these people have come down with this virus? I haven't heard of any. I know a lot of carers, and I speak to a lot of people, and I can assure you I haven't heard of any, none. And you talk about a blueprint, David. You mentioned Tony Abbott. That's fair enough, but I think who should be running that particular blueprint should be you. And you're the one that's got no. You're the one that's got your head around this, and you know exactly what's going on. You know our constitution backwards, and I think you should be a big part of that. And I'm not blowing the wind up your backside or anything like that. You know what's going on. It's most important that we have people that know what's going on, that is sincere. And unfortunately, we've got people in power that are not sincere. They're looking after their own little interests. And I've known you long enough now to know that you actually care for this country and care for the people in it. And that's most important. And I would trust you 100%. I really would. On that note, David, thank you very much to have this chat again. I really do appreciate it.
Well, thank you, Peter, and thank you for the job offer. It's very kind of you. Whether the politicians would consider me, I'm not terribly sure that they would. But on that point, thank you very much, and we'll bring this conversation to a close. Take Back Australia, and that article is in Spectator Australia. Just go to Spectator Australia, rather spectator.com.au, and you'll find it there.
Thank you, David.